Okay, so today we're going to take a deep dive into something pretty big, President Trump's executive order that starts the process of dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. We're going to be looking at some of the latest reporting from CNN to try and understand exactly what this order means. How are lawmakers reacting? How are different groups reacting?
Yeah.
And what might the future of education in the U.S. look like based on these developments and other things that are happening.
Right.
So as always, we want to kind of cut through all the headlines and really understand what are the core implications of this, for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things to think about right off the bat is that this is really tapping into a debate that's been going on for a long time.
Right.
There's been this conservative push for decades to have a smaller federal role in education.
Yeah.
And this was actually a key promise during President Trump's campaign, sending, quote, all education work and needs back to the states, close quote. So it's kind of interesting to remember that this level of federal involvement in education is actually relatively recent.
Right.
Before 1979, when President Jimmy Carter established the Department of Education as a cabinet-level agency, all these federal programs were spread across a bunch of different parts of the government.
Yeah, that's right. And this isn't even the first attempt to kind of do away with the Department of Education, right?
Yeah.
Back in the early 1980s, President Reagan also proposed eliminating it. That effort ultimately didn't gain much traction in Congress.
Right.
So I guess you could say that this recent executive order is kind of a really tangible step towards that vision of a smaller federal role in education.
Exactly. And, the executive order specifically directs the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, to, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return authority over education to the states and local communities, close quote. But it's really important for listeners to understand that an executive order is not the final word here.
Right.
To completely dismantle a cabinet-level department, it requires an act of Congress.
Yeah.
So this is really sort of the first move in what could be a more involved process.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit because, immediately you start to wonder about all the things that the Department of Education does, right?
Yeah.
So the White House has said that the agency will continue to oversee, quote, critical functions like student loans.
Yeah.
And President Trump also specifically mentioned that programs like Pell Grants, which, for those who aren't aware, that's a federal grant for students with financial need.
Right.
Also, things like Title High funding for low-income schools and funding for students with disabilities would be, quote, fully preserved, close quote.
Okay.
And then, quote, redistributed to various other agencies and departments, close quote. So,
this raises a really important practical question.
Right. What does that even look like?
Exactly how feasible is this redistribution on a large scale?
Yeah.
And some of the sources that we've been looking at highlight just how massive some of these programs are.
Right.
The federal student loan portfolio, for example, is reportedly around $1.8 trillion.
Wow.
So finding another existing agency that has the infrastructure and the expertise to manage something of that magnitude has apparently been a challenge.
Oh.
We've seen reports that the Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration were considered as potential new homes for some of these functions.
All right.
But so far, those plans haven't really materialized.
So you've got this existing structure and system to manage these really vital functions, right? And if that's not readily available elsewhere, what does that mean for people who rely on these programs? Will things continue to run smoothly?
Right. Could there be disruptions?
Will they be as effective? Right.
Exactly.
So,
and this is where some of those very different reactions that we've seen from lawmakers come into focus.
Okay.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has already voiced strong opposition to this executive order, calling it a, quote, destructive and devastating step.
Okay.
That he believes will hurt kids' parents and potentially even increase local property taxes.
Yeah. So these are strong reactions, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Indicating a really deep level of concern about what might happen. And Senator Elizabeth Warren also voiced similar concerns, right?
Yeah.
She described the move as a, quote, code red that will carry a, quote, heavy price, close quote, for public school students, parents, and teachers.
Right. So that's definitely one side of the reaction.
Yeah. So on the other hand, we have Republican lawmakers like Representative Tim Walberg, who chairs the House Education and Workforce Committee.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually supports this idea of a smaller federal role in education. And has said that he's looking forward to working with Secretary McMahon to, quote, get the federal government off the backs of students, families, educators, and taxpayers, close quote.
Right, and this really reflects that core conservative philosophy.
Right.
Of prioritizing local control over education we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and Senator Bill Cassidy, who chairs the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, also aligns with this view.
Oh, okay.
Right? He's also said that he agrees with President Trump and plans to, quote, support the president's goals by submitting legislation to accomplish this as soon as possible, close quote.
So you can really see that partisan divide emerging here.
Right.
Which is likely to shape how this plays out in Congress.
Absolutely. And it's not just, elected officials who are weighing in, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We've seen a lot of reactions from unions and different advocacy groups that I think offer some really important insights into what the potential real-world effects of this kind of dismantling could be. So one example is the American Federation of Government Employees, which represents Department of Education employees,
right,
has expressed strong, quote, outrage, close quote, at this executive order.
Yeah.
They've said that they believe that dismantling the agency would, quote, destroy our education system, close quote,
wow,
and really negatively impact future generations of students, particularly by weakening support for low-income students and students with disabilities.
It's interesting to think about the implications for all those different groups, especially those who might rely on that federal oversight.
Exactly. And there's also Democracy Forward, which is a legal organization that has announced that it plans to challenge the executive order in court, saying that it is unlawful.
Okay.
So this suggests that the administration's plans could face significant legal hurdles.
Yeah.
Right? Which, again, adds another layer of complexity to this whole process.
Absolutely. And legal challenges could definitely slow down or even halt the administration's plans. It's also interesting to consider how civil rights organizations are viewing this.
Yeah.
Groups like the National Urban League see this as much more than a simple, bureaucratic reorganization.
Right.
They believe it's an attempt to eliminate safeguards that are in place to protect marginalized students from discrimination and inadequate support.
So it's not just about efficiency.
Right.
It's also about potential consequences, right?
Okay.
For equity in education. And the National Black Justice Collective also shares those concerns, right?
Yeah.
Emphasizing that they believe that this action, quote, rips away critical funding and protections, close quote. For Black, LGBTQ plus rural and low-income students.
Right. Those groups that often rely on federal oversight and dedicated funding to make sure they have equal access to education.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it's also important to consider the perspective of Secretary of Education Linda McMahon herself.
Okay.
In public statements, she's really aligned with the administration's rationale for this. She stressed that education is, quote, fundamentally a state responsibility, close quote. And she believes that this move will ultimately, quote, empower states to take charge, close quote, and reduce federal red tape.
Interesting.
It's also worth noting that, when President Trump signed this executive order, he reportedly commented to Secretary McMahon that he hoped she wouldn't be there, quote, for too long, and that he would find, quote, something else, close quote, for her to do.
Oh, wow. It's kind of a strange comment, right?
Yeah, it almost hints at the specific timeline.
Right.
Or a sense that they want this to move quickly, at least in the initial phases.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But, as we've been discussing, the practical realities of actually unwinding a major federal department are incredibly complex.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And even the White House has clarified that while they're aiming to, quote, greatly minimize the agency, they've said that key functions like student loans and Pell Grants
will continue to be run by the Department of Education.
Okay.
At least for now.
So it sounds like while the executive order is a very clear signal of intent, the immediate practical impact on a lot of areas, like civil rights enforcement, Title I, funding support for special education, remains somewhat unclear.
Exactly. So the White House has said that, quote, critical functions will remain and that, quote, critical programs will be protected. But how exactly will that work within a much smaller department?
Yeah, the devil is often in the details, right?
Exactly.
How will these essential functions be managed effectively.
Right.
Potentially with fewer resources.
Right.
And a fundamentally different structure.
Yeah, those are really key questions that are still unanswered.
Absolutely. And I think those are things that you listening should be paying close attention to as this develops.
Right. So let's pull this all together.
Okay.
We have this executive order
Mm-hmm.
that starts the process of potentially dismantling the Department of Education, which is something that conservatives have wanted for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
But for this to actually happen, it would require further action from Congress.
Yeah.
And we've heard a really wide range of reactions from strong opposition, with concerns about negative consequences for students and schools, to people who support this move and emphasize, state control and less federal involvement.
Right.
So the future of federal education programs and that whole balance between federal and state authority in education is kind of up in the air right now.
Absolutely.
And I think if we connect this to the bigger picture for you listening, this has the potential to really reshape education in the U.S.
It really does.
And I think it's worth thinking about what the potential implications could be for your local schools.
Yeah.
Could funding models change?
Right.
How might access to financial aid for higher education be affected? And what are the broader consequences, for ensuring equal educational opportunities across states?
Especially because different states have such different levels of resources.
Exactly, and different priorities.
Right.
So I think this whole development really leaves us with a thought-provoking question.
Okay.
And it's this, given all these different reactions we've heard and the potential for legal challenges,
right,
how might the future of education in the U.S. really be shaped by this executive order and all the political and legal battles that are likely to follow?
Yeah. What parts of our current system?
Right.
How schools are funded, how they're overseen, how civil rights are protected.
Exactly.
Might be most impacted.
Right. And what could those long-term consequences be for students and communities?
Yeah, that's something to watch closely.
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.